I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists. Naming something.
California has experienced this increasing trend in terms of the number of acres that have burned over the last 2 decades. In this graph, I'm showing you the number of wildfires each year from 2002 to 2019, as well as the number of acres burned. If you look at the number of wildfires shown in the blue, you might notice that there's big years and little years, but generally speaking, California actually sees about 8,000 wildfires a year, though most of them are so small that they never make the news. But in terms of the acres burned, that's where we see a lot more fluctuation year to year. And we're also seeing an increasing trend line in terms of the number of
Hey,
acres.
Rebecca, oh, never mind.
Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was gonna say
there's a way
I thought you
disable?
skipped the slide because it turned pink, so I was gonna say not trying to interrupt you or anything.
Sorry,
Just wanna make
Roman
sure.
just said I can disable annotation, so thank you for that. I just did. Let's see if we can progress this presentation. All right.
You said more men.
Roman. Okay. So thank you for that. All right. So what I was saying was that the number of wildfires has remained fairly steady in California over the last 2 decades, but actually the number of acres burned seems because the number of acres has been increasing. But this graph doesn't actually show 2020, which had far more acres burned than we've ever seen before in California. For context, 4.1 million acres burned in California in 2020. That's about 4% of the entire state of California. But even then, the number of wildfires in California still remained fairly steady at around that 8,000 to 9,000 number per year, which means that these fires are growing bigger, even though the number of them has remained fairly constant. And it also means that if they're growing bigger, they have to be burning something, which means that they're burning some kind of fuel. And fuel can mean a lot of different things. This is an example of 2 different fires that took place in 2018. The one that you see on the left is the Mendocino Complex fire, which burned primarily in national forests around Lake County. And the one that you see on the right is the Camp Fire, which I think many of us are aware burned in Butte County in 2018. It's the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California's history. But the things that are burning in these 2 pictures are really different. The one on the left, you see a lot of forests burning. You see this big crown fire with the fire all the way up in the tops of the trees. But in the Camp Fire, I believe this is a gas station or a convenience store that's burning. So you can have infrastructure or communities that can burn, and those can also be fuel. But when we think about fuel, we also have to remember that there's going to be forests and trees and shrubs that will also constitute fuel. And in this presentation, as I talk about prescribed burns, I'm going to focus on the types of fuels that you see on the left, the natural fuels that we think of vegetation. And the way that you can get rid of some of these fuels is through something called a fuel treatment. And a fuel treatment is an activity that is purposefully intended to reduce or rearrange fuels within a given area. So I'll show you this before picture on the top. If you look in this area, it looks like maybe imagine what you think. Excuse me? Yes.
What's that blue shit on the tree?
Those are tree markers. They're useful for research. The image that you see on the top shows a forest that is fairly cluttered. And then below, you would see essentially that same forest after a fuel treatment has gone through. You might notice that the before picture looks pretty crowded, and the after picture looks much more
Rebecca, your screen is frozen.
That's important as well when we think about these fuel treatments because of the vast acreage in California that actually needs fuel treatments. There are 20 million acres in California that need fuel treatments, which comes down to about 20% of the entire state of California could use fuel treatments. I'll draw your attention here to the primarily red areas on the map, mostly in Northern California, which are areas that have missed up to 5 or more natural fire cycles, meaning that there's tremendous overgrowth in these areas in the red. Unfortunately, for many of us, me included in the Bay Area, live.
Hey, real quick, how did you measure that 20 million acres need fuel in the last slide?
This is from CAL FIRE. So CAL FIRE made this determination looking at historic wildfire patterns, and the time that has elapsed
Hellfire.
between prior fires. The reason that we need so many fuel treatments is because of historic wildfire suppression policies, which resulted in overgrowth in forests. If any of you have been reading newspaper articles about the wildfires in California, you've probably seen things about historic wildfire suppression policies, which essentially said that wildfire was terrible for about 70 years. And those fire policies trickled down from the federal level down to the state level and ensured that fire was treated as a bad thing with the goal of keeping it as small as possible at all times. Now, of course, we know that fire is actually extremely beneficial to the ecosystem, but we didn't necessarily understand that or recognize that in the past. And so you can see the impact of these historic wildfire suppression policies in the two pictures here, both of which show Yosemite Valley. On the left is Yosemite in 1899. You could imagine walking in this valley, putting your arms out, and not being able to necessarily touch a tree on either hand. There's a lot of distance. It's what John Muir called a park-like environment. But then you look at the right, 60 years later, after historic wildfire suppression policies have been enacted, these trees are much more tightly packed together. You could imagine putting your arms out and very easily touching trees on either side. And it also means that there's a lot of opportunity for infestation and growth, and it's a lot more packed. It's a lot less healthy of a forest. And even though we've gotten rid of those wildfire suppression policies, their long-term impacts remain because we're still looking at nearly 100 years of not letting fire go through, whether that was natural fire or indigenous burning practices. And so here we have that same valley, 1899, very spread out, 2011, even more tightly packed than we saw in the previous slide in 1961. But even though we know that fire suppression is generally not going to be the solution, we need to be putting more fire in the ecosystems, we're still actually spending most of our money on suppressing fires instead of preventing fires. This is looking at CAL FIRE budgets. You might see on the top, the fire response budget seems to be increasing pretty significantly every single year, whereas the fire prevention, which includes fuel treatments, still remains pretty small. CAL FIRE generally spends about 5 times more on responding to fires than it does on preventing fires, doing things like fuel treatments. And when I talk about fuel treatments, I'm generally talking about one of 3 things. So I'm going to focus here on prescribed burns. The first is prescribed burns, which I'll get to in the next few slides. The second is mechanical thinning, which is when you might physically go into an area and actually practically remove timber, whether it's through a machine or some other tool. And then there's something called managed wildfire, which is when a natural fire ignites from lightning strikes in a federal land, like a national forest or a national park, and it's far enough away from other people that it won't affect anyone, and we can let that burn safely. But as I said, I'm going to really focus on prescribed burns here. And prescribed burns are fires that are purposefully set under very controlled conditions to clear ground fuels. This is an image of a prescribed burner using a blowtorch to set fire to the ground fuels. It might look a little scary when we look at this picture, but this is actually done under such specific controlled conditions that there's no way that this fire could escape or burn anything down. That means you've got really high humidity, you've got low temperatures, the wind conditions are really nice.
Hey,
Because
Rebecca,
Yes,
do you take that picture yourself?
I did not. I'd love to answer all of your questions, but I'd also really love to get through the presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of the images at the end. So this prescribed burn is done under these specialized conditions to make sure that they remain very safe, which is great. But the problem is we have so many more wildfires than we do prescribed burns. This is a map that looks at the wildfires distributed across California over about the last 2 decades, compared to the number of prescribed burns and the area burned through prescribed burns during that same time period. And you might notice that there's a lot more red on this map than there is black on this map. So more wildfires, not enough prescribed burns, which doesn't mean that we aren't aware of the fact that we need prescribed burns. Lots of newspaper articles recently have recognized the intense need to bring more fire to the ecosystem, to prevent the next big wildfire. Let the forest burn. There's an opinion article. Or fire ecologists say more fires should be left to burn, so why aren't they? And prescribed fire gains momentum. So the purpose of my talk here today is to talk about why aren't we using more prescribed burns? Seems like a great tool, fabulous fuel treatment, it's pretty cost effective, it returns fire to the ecosystem, but we're just not using as much of it as we should be. Well, the good news that I'll share is that the number of acres that we're using for prescribed burns is on the rise. I'll note that this is just a fraction of all the prescribed burns across California, but you can see that the solid line there, which is the number of acres burned, is steadily increasing. And this is just a really quick snapshot across just a small sliver of California, but it is on the rise.
Why aren't we using prescribed fire?
Wait, I've got to ask a question, please. If you have a question, pardon me for interrupting you, but please, no questions during Rebecca's presentation. She'll entertain them at the end.
Thank you, Tucker. But this begs the question.
Sorry.
If we are aware that prescribed burns are valuable because they return fire to an ecosystem, the question is, why aren't we actually planning for more acres? So why is this dashed line of the acres that we're planning for burning not actually higher? And I conducted about 40 interviews across California to start answering some of these questions about the challenges related to prescribed burns. And it turns out that there's a lot of concerns about risk that prevent potential burners from even starting that process of burning. These relate specifically to liability laws, and they also relate to negative public opinion. And the liability laws make a lot of sense. It's really scary to think about setting fire to your property, to clear out those fuels, and then, oh my goodness, what if you burn your neighbor's house down? And then you're held liable for that. Nobody wants to have that kind of a responsibility for them. But there's a nice potential solution there in the form of the state legislature, which work to develop new policies to say that if you take a training class and you become certified as a burner, if you're doing prescribed burns to clear out ground fuels to help prevent these wildfires from happening, that'll reduce your liability. And another big concern that was preventing people from burning was this fear of negative public opinion. Maybe, the public's going to really hate having the smoke from a prescribed burn. The public's going to hate being around a prescribed burn. It's scary. Well, the great news is that, first of all, education programs are incredibly effective when it comes to prescribed burns. And actually, negative public opinion is not really the problem that a lot of people might think that it is. Here's an interview that I did with somebody following the Santa Rosa fires in 2019, who said, quite frankly, I think that county policies, CAL FIRE policies for fining properties who are not keeping up with vegetation management should quadruple. I know it's always been an issue to keep up with vegetation management on private properties, but I think in today's climate, with what we've gone through, there needs to be
Is this a part of the
harsher
negative public
penalties
opinion?
because it could save a life. And this is actually an example of how the public likes prescribed burns. The public wants more fuel treatments. Public sentiment actually often supports having more fuel treatments. So even though there's this perception among prescribed burners that negative public opinion is stopping them from doing the burning process, that's actually not an issue at all, which is great because it's one less thing for us to be concerned about and might mean that we're looking towards having more acres being planned for prescribed burns. But then we have this other issue. Great. We're going to start increasing the number of acres that are planned for burns, increase that dashed line up. But why is there this gap in general? Why are we planning to burn more acres than we're actually burning? Again, based on my interviews, I found that there were some serious challenges facing both federal landowners as well as state and private landowners, and I'll get to them in the next slide. But for the federal landowners, I want to draw your attention to this map on the right, which is a map of California. And these challenges are going to be associated with all the places that you see there in the green. That's federal lands, U.S. Forest Service lands, National Park Service lands, Bureau of Land Management, etc. And on these lands, they face three major issues. First, they were dealing with limited funding. If you ever talk to anyone in the federal government, they will always tell you that there's not enough money in the budget for anything. Well, consistent funding for fire prevention would definitely help with that. I also heard a lot of concerns about not enough training or certification programs, that there would be people who were experts in something, experts in prescribed burns, but they'd get old and they'd retire, and there wouldn't be a training program for these new burners to come in. But again, potential solution there, institute a training or a certification program. And I also heard another challenge about bad weather conditions. You know, the temperature's too hot, the humidity was too low, it wasn't actually safe to burn. But being able to deploy prescribed burners more agilely could really help with that. So maybe the condition's not right in this particular spot, but it's really good 100 miles away. And then people could run over and take care of the burns right over there. But again, this is federal issues. These are resource and regulation related challenges specific to the federal government and the federal agencies. But there were separate problems on the state and private side. And for that, I want to turn your attention again to the map. I mentioned that the green area was all of the federal land in California, so federally owned land. That's about 46% of the entire state of California. But state and private land represents the pink and the yellow areas. So across all those pink and yellow areas, these two challenges are going to remain. And those challenges are not enough firefighters available to actually do the prescribed burns. So there's not enough people in CAL FIRE, for example, who know how to do prescribed burns and can be deployed to do prescribed burns. But there's some potential solutions. We could have a dedicated prescribed burn crew that would be available to travel around the state conducting these prescribed burns. And another challenge, again, on the pink and yellow areas, the state and private lands, was environmental regulations. Concerns about things like CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, or the need to fill out lots of bureaucratic forms which might prevent somebody from conducting a burn. What was interesting was that when I did these interviews with people, they didn't actually have a suggestion for how to deal with these environmental regulations, in large part because nobody wanted to change them so much that there'd be fewer protections on the natural landscape. So, big picture, what does all of this mean? The big point that I want you to know is that there's concerns about risk that are preventing prescribed burns from being planned. But those challenges have started to be addressed through new legislation that's come through the state legislature. But there's still a lot of problems in that gap between planning to do a burn and then actually conducting a burn. And those challenges, like the funding, like not enough firefighters, not enough prescribed burners, those are in the process of being addressed. And actually addressing those challenges might help California reach the fuel treatment goals that it has to prevent some of these future catastrophic wildfires. And I'll share with you now what some state policymakers are doing on this exact topic. So, what could actually increase the use of prescribed burns? Generally speaking, political support for prescribed burns is incredibly helpful. You can get a lot more political support when escapes are quite rare. About 2% of prescribed burns escape, and most of those escapes stay really small. You only really hear in the news about the ones that, really escape because it's terrible weather conditions and burns coming down. But that's such a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of prescribed burns that might escape. And most of them are incredibly successful. And here's a quote, again, from one of the interviews that I did. "I can't say enough about CAL FIRE changing its cultures. Things have changed so much since 2009. And a lot of that is because of the Brown administration and Ken Pimlott, who was the former head of CAL FIRE. And both the Brown administration and Ken Pimlott, and through the Newsom administration, there's been tremendous desire to have more prescribed burns. And that political support from the executive branch, as well as, I'll show you from the legislative branch, helps create new policy opportunities for prescribed burns. So here's a look at the wildfire-related bills that the legislature's proposed over the last 2 decades. One thing that might immediately pop out at you, looking at the circle lines, is that the number of bills related to wildfire in general has skyrocketed in the last 2 legislative sessions. There were over 100 bills about wildfires proposed in the last 2 years, far more than there ever had been before. But I'll also draw your attention to the green and the red. The green line, that's mechanical fitting. That's that other type of fuel treatment that I didn't really talk too much about. But even that's seeing a nice increase in terms of legislative attention. And then prescribed burns. Almost 20 bills related to prescribed burns were proposed in the last legislative session. A huge increase compared to even a couple of years earlier, demonstrating a lot more attention from the state legislature. And what's also great is that a lot of those bills actually passed and brought new initiatives even just in the last few years, including training and certification programs, more funding for fire prevention, for prescribed burns, great public education programs to allow you to come see a prescribed burn, see it in action, learn how beneficial they are. Changes to those personal liability and insurance concerns, assuming that you have been trained. And a new program that just came out, I believe last year, called the Vegetation Treatment Program, or CAL-VTP, which seeks to match ecological need with fuel treatment type. And so here's an example of the CAL-VTP. This is a proposed project near where I live at Stanford, which is a combination of mechanical thinning and prescribed burns. It's going to be 80 or 90 acres in total. And that's great. Every little bit helps. And this is a great example of this new program in action. And this is so unbelievably important that we're seeing these changes from the legislature, because historically, California's fuel treatment goals have fallen far short of recommendations. Ideally, we'd be treating 1 million acres a year in California. Again, we have a 20 million acre deficit. 1 million acres would be fantastic to start chipping away at that deficit. But if we look at federal land goals, generally, they're looking at aiming for about 500,000 acres a year on federal lands, which is fantastic. It's about half of our ideal goal. But historically, our state and private lands goal has been minimal, to say the least, 20, 30,000 acres a year. So our total goal is just over 500,000 acres, half of what we really need. But with these new proposals, with these new efforts in place, look at how this changes. This is incredibly recent. By 2025, state and private land goals for fuel treatment are expected to reach 500,000 acres a year, which combined with our federal land goals will get to 1 million acres a year, which is such a great move and something that we sorely need in California. So it's going to be a huge ramp up, but the effort will be worth it. And a lot of that also comes from Governor Newsom's proposed budget, which helps to support this really ambitious goal, specifically on state and private lands, where we have this big gap, particularly in California, where the state government has no control over what happens on federal lands. So this budget includes $512 million for vegetation projects, including prescribed burns, $335 million for creating 45 fuel breaks every single year, and then $75 million to incentivize timber companies to thin trees to do mechanical thinning. But what can you do to support more prescribed burns? Strongly encourage you to contact your state legislator. Think about, was there a particular challenge here that you were passionate about, that you want to get more involved in? The state legislators, I've done a lot of interviews with the staff there. They would love to hear from you to get your opinion. I also encourage you to join a training program. If you think, I want to do a prescribed burn, there are training programs that are done all the time. You can learn how to use one of those blow torches. California Fire Science Consortium runs a number of these. And then you can also check just in your local backyard. Does your local community have a land trust or a preserve that might be a great candidate for a prescribed burn? Maybe CAL-VTP might have its next project in your backyard. Thank you so much for this, and I'm happy to take all of your questions as we think together about how to bring more prescribed burns to California.
Rebecca, thank you. And I appreciate your insight and your strength in standing up against the Zoom bombing here. Very early on, Bill Jacobs asked a question, which seems like it's a goodie here. I'm curious if the different mix of tree species at different latitudes changes their burning properties, and so prescribed burn strategies.
That is a great question. There's a lot of ecosystem science and a lot of prescribed burn science that is looking specifically at things like different latitudes, different ecosystem types. And so, for example, I was really talking a lot here about forest management when we think about traditional forests, but there's a really different response if you were to talk to somebody who's really passionate about chaparral, for example. And so chaparral is prescribed burning is a little bit more complicated there because it can actually introduce non-native species. And so I'm not sure entirely about the specifics of the latitude changes that you're talking about, though the general suggestion that I would have is that every single one of these field treatments, whether mechanical thinning or prescribed burn or any combination of them, needs to be best suited for the specific ecosystem that you're talking about. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of situation. You really need to be aware of the ecosystem and the plants and the vegetation and what their fire cycles traditionally have been and what they need and expect.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kimmy has raised her virtual hand here. So Kimmy, let me ask you to unmute yourself and perhaps make yourself visible and ask your question. Kimmy may have left us. No, I'm not seeing her or hearing her question. Well, Pavan Ramasetti asks, what can we do to get our political representatives to change these policies and laws? That was the subject of your very last slide, Rebecca, but maybe would you summarize one or two of those key points again?
Absolutely. My general suggestion, having spoken to a lot of, as I said, a lot of legislative staff in Sacramento, is that wildfire is a very hot topic, pun intended, within the state legislature. There's a lot of enthusiasm for proposing bills related to specifically mitigation, so specifically about things like fuel treatments. There's many, many, many bills that have been proposed in the last few years about that particular topic. And what I would suggest you do is figure out what specifically is an issue that you're trying to address. There's a lot of very general bills that might get proposed, but if you're particularly excited about this question of liability or insurance, or you're particularly passionate about the public education of things like prescribed burns, having a good sense of what a real solution might be and what it might take to craft something like that certainly be something that they'd be interested in. But also even telling your state legislative staffer, I'm really excited about this. I want a bill. I want you to propose a bill about prescribed burns. Maybe you could get in contact with this particular lobbyist or this particular nonprofit group, and they might have a really good idea of what they'd like to have in a bill because they're very in the ground. They're aware of what the challenges are. Whereas somebody in the state legislature might not have a lot of experience with something like prescribed burns, the way that you could imagine somebody with the Nature Conservancy or the Sierra Club might have a really refined understanding of the particulars, and making those kinds of connections, or even just sharing your desire for change can be extremely effective.